Outsiders. Good morning, opinion lovers everywhere, and welcome to Outsiders, the show that is to white privilege, unconscious bias, and woke stereotyping on steroids. What the politicians of Ireland are to talking common sense.
While it's true that the Irish have known a fair share of oppression, the reality is during that oppression we still maintained our invisibility cloak of white privilege.
And we often hear about white privilege, and it hadn't really occurred to me that I had white privilege as well, but now, listening to you, I understand that I do have a privilege.
I think we shouldn't forget that our Parliament still looks very male, very stale and pale.
Of course you can say that. You're a middle-class white man.
Yes, that's the Irish Parliament, hard at work tackling the important issues of the day.
You, as a white privileged man, how does my debt impact your life?
I think it's worth putting on the record of this House that concept of white privilege and how that can be normatised in our own lives. And, you know, we as we develop as a society in a more racially integrated society, but the corollary being that your whiteness is itself an advantage.
There's serious work that needs to be done in the context of Irish politics, because even when you look at a male-dominated politics, who are the males dominating that? And the majority are more privileged, are predominantly white.
Yeah, the last thing we want to do is replace a bunch of straight, white, middle-class, able-bodied men with a bunch of straight, white, middle-class, able-bodied women.
Oh, dear!
But is it just the women who are total Egypts in the Irish Parliament? Well, it would really appear not.
One of their party or two of their party will be from, their background maybe from a different country, and they are, celebrating that and they are engaged in that much more so than the very dull, white, pasty Ireland that I grew up in.
I think what we need to do in our own political system is to call out the hypocrisy of standing in a parliament like this, full of white people.
There is obviously a fairly obvious deficiency in what we're doing. We're basically a room full of white men talking about racism. So just to name that.
Ooh, just to name that, white privilege. And now enough of that Irish gobshite. Let's kiss the Blarney Stone and grab the latest Outsiders privileged news. Well, it's not looking so great, not looking so crash hot for Anthony Albanese. Now, Outsiders viewers, of course, who will remember that months ago we've been saying that Albo would be a oncer, a one-term Prime Minister. We've been saying, particularly since The Voice, that Peter Dutton was looking stronger and more likely, and I keep saying and keep repeating, he will win the next election. Well, it seems like the rest of the media have finally caught up with Outsiders. Nothing strange there. What we say in June, July tends to be the facts come October, November. So we've had the Sydney Morning Herald, we've had the ABC, we've had the Australian. They're all out there now suddenly discovering Peter Dutton could be the next Prime Minister. What a shock, what a surprise. Rita, did this blow you away, this news that we have an opposition leader who's doing really well?
Well, what happens when an opposition leader actually opposes? When he actually comes to the table with differing views, giving the electorate a different set of policies, as we saw with the referendum. He was very clear in where the coalition stood and where he stood, and the result was emphatic, 61% to 39%. And now we've got the front pages of the Herald Sun, Sunday Herald Sun, Sunday Telegraph. Just nightmare fuel for Albo. I think we've already put up the Daily Telly's Albo, a beta male. This is out of research, James, that is going to absolutely devastate him. And Herald Sun's gone with reform or die. And this is Bill Shorten's big push. He is really...
Bill Shorten, you say?
Yes. Bill Shorten,
Bill
just riding his time. He's talking there about the NDIS and how there needs to be changes to save it and to save lives. And let's not forget, Bill Shorten has played a very smart game. He didn't say much during the Voice referendum, so his hands are pretty clean there. He's been fairly sane when it comes to international foreign affairs, particularly
He's good on Israel. He is good on Israel.
So I think he's just sitting back and watching Albo self-implode, and along with a bunch of his senior ministers who've absolutely disgraced themselves with their gutter politics this week, is alleging that Peter Dutton is some sort of a pedophile protector, James?
That's disgraceful. Tell us about it,
It is
James.
disgraceful. I want to get to that in a second, but, you know, what we're seeing here is something that, as you said, Rowan, we've known all along, and people are just waking up to. You know, Albo came into office, and everybody said, oh, big change, you know, coalition's gone, Labour is back. And I'm getting so much of the same energy right now that we had, you know, in 2009. I'm even getting what we had in 2011, 2012 out of this year, because the exact same thing has happened. You know, just as when Kevin Rudd came in, and everybody said, oh, no one's ever going to vote Conservative again. The whole country is shifting to the left. You know, the Liberals are dead, the coalition dead in the water, and Tony Abbott in 2010 took huge strips off of him. In 2013, won handily, smashed Labour. But we're seeing the same thing happen, but happening faster now because, again, with Kevin Rudd, everybody woke up and realized, you know, they've just got Albo. And Albo, I'm sorry, you know, he's just not that impressive a bloke. And
well,
none of
the
this
worse
stuff,
than that, he's not impressive as a prime minister.
He's not
whatever he's like as a bloke is irrelevant. He's a useless prime minister.
Well, he is, because here's the thing. He's got no grand narrative that says, here's what Labour is doing. Everything that they're doing is just simply making things worse and then trying to make them better. And people have picked up on this. This is fascinating because the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph poll, it was by Redbridge. That's a Labour-aligned firm.
Yes.
This is not, you know, you can't have all the people out there, all the truthers on Twitter going, oh, no, it's just a news poll or something like that. This is Redbridge, all right? You know, you've got people like Kos Samaras in there, and the focus groups are devastating because the focus groups said that nobody thinks this guy is up to the job, and they called him a beta male, which has got to have him in a great mood this morning.
I can't wait till we see the new macho Albo in reaction to this. He's just going to be wearing muscle T-shirts
He'd be like
and working out.
He could get on a horse and go down a creek
He'll be
looking for
doing
a
the
bear.
Robert F. Kennedy thing, lifting weights.
But we're going to see an image shift because we know he's very image conscious. And I think people have just worked him out. He went into this election, well, the last election, alleging to be a moderate, alleging to be a sensible
He's a lefty.
adult. He's always been in Labor's socialist left faction. That's who he is. And I remember that front page that the Daily Telegraph ran with Albo saying, I'm not woke. But every policy he's been putting in place, from the Voice to the climate change lunacy, is woke. I mean, you look at the actions, not their words, and the actions speak for themselves.
But I just want to go back to what Rowan mentioned before here, too, this disgraceful attack that Labour mounted this week on Peter Dutton and the coalition as protectors of pedophiles. This was this bizarre thing around this piece of legislation that they voted against. But the really fascinating thing, and this is where, again, this idea of Albanese being weak comes in, because he sent his ministers, he let ministers like Claire O'Neill go out there and attack Dutton in the most vicious and vile terms. This also comes from, there was that item in the news several weeks ago, small item that said the Albanese government was going to start a much more robust opposition research strategy. This was its first outing this past week in Parliament. They fell straight on their face, and because Anthony Albanese would not then go out and either stand by what his ministers said or disclaim it, and he just simply said, well, I'm just the Prime Minister. I have no responsibility for what my ministers say. Well, everybody said, that looks so weak. Stand by your people or smack them down.
What happened there? Because there's two trains of thought: that he threw his ministers under the bus by not standing behind them and backing up what they said, as crazy as it was, or that he was distancing himself. I mean, what do you think happened there? Because no doubt they would have seen the reaction.
What happened was, as James just said, he is weak. and he is woke. I mean, what a ghastly combination, weak and woke. I guess the two often go hand in hand. But Rita...
I think he stood by his ministers. That's what I was trying to convey. I think he actually didn't necessarily abandon their position, because despite the backlash, he refused to, just say, things got heated, things were said that shouldn't have been said, that were unwise. He didn't rebuke them as you would expect after such a ridiculous, outrageous statement. So to me,
but the bloke's drowning. The bloke's drowning. He's waving his hand and drowning, because on every single front, it's a disaster. I said last week you can judge all Labor's policies and actions by the 3 I's. Ideology, first and foremost, followed by idiocy, followed by incompetence. Every single issue. We saw it again yesterday when we were talking to Alex Antic about this later in the show, how Katie Gallagher came out and said they're announcing this big digital ID. We've been saying for months on this show, do not touch this digital ID. It is poison. It will strip you of your liberties and your personal freedoms. The digital ID is guaranteed COVID on steroids. IDs, or swiping your way into every cafe. Do not touch it. Katie Gallagher comes out and says, oh, no, this isn't going to be mandatory. Straight away, Twitter is onto her saying, no, she's wrong. And they've called out one of Albanese's ministers, top ministers, as being wrong, misinformation. Their own, your own misinformation, guys. You were caught out by this sort of thing. Every single issue, James, you go through, disaster after disaster. We've had the Gazan refugees. We really want 800-odd people coming from Gaza. That's such an intelligent idea, isn't it? Really smart for the immigration.
Hang on, Rowan.
They're going to be vetted.
They're going to be vetted. When opinion polls show that 75% of Palestinians agree with the actions Hamas took, which resulted in rape, murder, and the worst atrocities. Let's grab them. What a great bonus for us.
I'm sorry, Rowan. I have got to pull you up on this here.
Please do.
Because on the form that they fill out, it says, have you been involved in any terrorist activity? Are you a terrorist sympathizer? Now, if they tick no, they could be up for a fine. So seriously, though, this is this Gaza thing. I'm glad you mentioned it, because this is an absolute outrage and a disgrace. Every day we see more and more footage of the Gazan people out there cheering, beating, jeering at hostages, jeering at them when they're being released. And we're supposed to accept that these people are just going to come in here and they all are just, fully on board with the Australian program, fully on board with fighting anti-Semitism and all of that. Come on, that's nonsense. But all of this stuff here, every area, Rita, where Albanese is making mistakes there, they're real coalition heartland areas.
Yes, that's the point.
We're talking about border security.
Yep.
We are talking about energy policy.
The detainees,
and all of this. All of these are the areas that they had a whole hairy-chested routine going in, saying, "Oh, we're going to be tough on all of this stuff," and oh, we're going to bring your power bills down and all this. Well, the climate stuff is absolutely falling apart. We're going to talk to somebody from Dubai at the COP28 in a little bit, but the detainee thing, we've seen the first boat come in and land on Australian shores. So we have boats back. I mean, everything is falling apart.
The defence, you haven't mentioned the defence.
Because they're absolutely terrified of that border protection issue. It was something that had been, it wasn't an issue for the last couple of elections because they stopped the boat. The coalition stopped the boat. Something that the media and Labor and the Greens told us was not possible because there was push factors, not pull factors behind the boats arriving.
Remember all that nonsense?
We proved that was not the case. So the boats were stopped. Labor were saying, no, we're completely on board with these policies. We're not going to tinker with them. We've learnt from what's happened in the past. They haven't learnt, and they are weak on this. And their party is weak on this. This isn't in their DNA. They don't like these policies. They don't like these tough...
But we have...
And also remember how I've mentioned before, every time the left talk, they invert the language. They switch the language around. So this, Rita and James mentioned this disgraceful labelling of Peter Dutton as someone who protects pedophiles or whatever, completely disgraceful, when it is Labor's policies, Labor's inaction, James, Labor's complete mishandling of the NZYQ case. This is this bloke who they've allowed to be released thanks to the High Court. They were never prepared for it. The entire Albanese strategy was based on the voice. He's a one-trick pony. Right from day one, it was the voice. The voice was going to carry him through to the next election. He'd be a great hero of the left.
But also,
when the voice went down, as we said on this show, that was the end of Albanese. All the other commentators, every other commentator said, oh, no, that's going to have nothing to do with the next election. People will have forgotten by it. Rubbish. Had completely trashed Albanese. It's completely undermined the self-confidence of the Labor Party. They're all running around like headless chooks with no policies, James, and mistake after mistake after mistake, which is costing this country a fortune, costing us our defence. We've now got Chris Bowen wandering around COP28 when COP28 wants to be nuclear. As we've always said on this show, if you really want to get to net zero, you must go nuclear, James.
Well, Rowan, I mean, you know, the NZYQ case, this is the case, by the way, just for everybody to really understand what happened here.
Yes.
There was a Rohingya Myanmar individual here on a refugee protection visa. He sexually assaulted, raped a 10-year-old boy, lost his character grounds visa on that point, was put in immigration detention. The full reasons from the High Court were released this week. Now, Claire O'Neill had gone out and said, we thought we were going to win this. If you read paragraph 5 of the decision the High Court handed down, it is so clear that the O'Neill office knew that they had no chance of winning this case as far back as May, that there was no way that they were going to be able. They tried to pawn him off on some other country. No other country wants this guy. So, you know, they knew that they were in trouble with this. And then here's the crazy thing. You read the whole judgment. The judgment just applies to this one guy. And then the government decides, oh, well, everybody else, let's just release everybody who could apply to. It's just ridiculous.
Ideology followed by idiocy, followed by incompetence. Every single Labor policy under this government. Ideology, idiocy, incompetence. And even, you know, let's talk about COP28. Net zero, this great pledge to get down our electricity prices by 275. Instead, they've gone through the roof. Nuclear is the only answer, yet Bowen and 48 of his overpaid Canberra bureaucrats are over there, no doubt.
How many?
48.
What?
Yeah, have accompanied Bowen as they're going to sit there.
Heard of Zoom.
Exactly, sitting there in Dubai. Sitting there in Dubai while Dubai are talking about going nuclear. And they've gone, oh, no, we can't possibly go nuclear. This government is a joke. The sooner they're gone, the better, being replaced by a Dutton government.
That's almost as much as I said to Garma.
But before we get more into COP, we had just before on Sky News, Matt Keane, from the New South Wales Liberals.
Desperately chasing relevance.
Whilst we're talking about Anthony Albanese floundering and his government being in peril, possibly a one-term government, let's not forget that the Libs at state level, whether you're talking about Victoria, New South Wales, even the government they have in Tasmania, they are floundering. They are at a crisis point where they need to figure out who they are, what they stand for, and what they're offering their electorate. Because at the moment, we are seeing this emergence of conservative thought in this country that the Voice unveiled, and they're not seizing upon that. They are so weak that they cannot divorce themselves from these positions they've taken that are going to ensure they remain in opposition.
And worse than that, Rita, they're using they've ignored the electorate. The Murray-Darling thing, which we'll talk about later, is basically the Voice on stealth. They've acknowledged water rights going to First Nations people. We'll talk about that later. But more importantly, right now, at COP28 this week, many attending countries launched a declaration. So COP28 is the annual climate change, the United Nations, blah, blah, blah thing. A declaration to triple nuclear energy capacity by 2050. Even though our eco-warrior Chris Bowen was there, Australia was not. You know, we've got more uranium than anybody else, but are we taking advantage of this momentous stage in world history where the world is going to start going nuclear? No, we're doing nothing. Joining us now is William Shackle, founder of Nuclear for Australia. Will, great to see you. You're over there in Dubai. It's very late at night. Thank you so much for staying up. Tell us why you're the only Australian there supporting nuclear energy. What are these other 49 clowns doing? Are they sitting in the cafe? Are they, what are they doing? Are they invited into any of the meetings? What's going on, Will?
Look, I haven't actually seen many of the Australian delegation at COP28, but what I sure have seen is all of the people from around the world, from the 32 countries around the world that currently have nuclear energy. And I've seen them, I've been able to talk to them and been able to gain their perspective where they've been able to show me the success that they're having with nuclear energy. So I think in your framing at the start of this interview, you're correct. The world is going nuclear, and COP28 is just the foundation of that, especially with the pledge to triple global nuclear energy capacity by 2050, but also really importantly, the setting of COP28 this year. The UAE is home to the largest source of clean energy in the region, the Baraka nuclear power plant, which was built in around a decade's time. So there is no better place to have COP28 this year, and nuclear is one of the major focuses at this COP, which I think is a great thing for the world, because it's one thing, of course, that nuclear energy is a great solution for climate change, but as well as that, if we do want to reach net zero, we need to consider solutions like nuclear if we want to keep the lights on, if we want to keep electricity bills down as well.
James.
Tell us more, Will, about this declaration that just came down, and I think it was led by the United States, announced by John Kerry, the great climate warrior, announcing this pledge to triple nuclear energy. Tell us what there's actually called for. What does that mean in practice? And, you know, I know you say you haven't seen much of the Australian delegation, but surely this would leave Chris Bowen hanging out on a limb.
Yeah, okay. So in regards to the pledge which was signed, actually yesterday, I wasn't actually unfortunately there, but basically they're calling for a tripling of global nuclear energy capacity by 2050. This was a ministerial pledge that they made. There's also going to be a pledge by corporations in the nuclear industry on the 5th of December, which is expected to join this to make sure that this is an actual target which they're going to be able to make. But it's a huge announcement, and it's also expected to be joined by a declaration calling on the World Bank and other financial institutions to up their game and open up their lending policies to also include nuclear energy, given it's such a clean solution. Look, I think it is disappointing that the Australian delegation, in the context of all that's happening with nuclear energy at COP, is not coming to the table. We're really just sitting on the sidelines when it comes to nuclear energy at this year's COP, and I think that's really disappointing. So I hope that when the minister turns up next week and when there's some more action from the Australian delegation, if they want to be taken seriously on climate action, then they need to consider the role of nuclear energy, because we know nuclear energy is one of the cleanest forms of power, and it is the most reliable form of power. So if we want to be taken seriously on climate change, especially when Australia is not on track to reach our emissions targets, we need to look at other options. And for me, that has to include nuclear energy.
Well, Chris Bowen seems to be an absolute ideologue when it comes to this. Have you had any influence speaking to, perhaps not him, but speaking to bureaucrats and trying to impress upon them that the rest of the world has moved on? The rest of the world is utilising our uranium often to give their citizens clean, cheap, reliable energy.
Well, look, not specifically in regard to Australian bureaucrats. I've made a petition calling on the Australian delegation at COP28 to support nuclear energy, which has over 4,500 signatures at nuclearforaustralia.com/COP28. So that's one of my main messaging tools to get to the Australian delegation at COP28. But the interesting thing is I've been able to talk to lots of world leaders here at COP28. It's funny how they just walk through and you're able to ask them questions. I've been able to meet a lot of people, including John Kerry. I've asked him about the nuclear involvement. I had a chance also to speak to Emmanuel Macron and lots of other leaders. And they've all impressed upon me the fact that Australia should consider the role of nuclear energy. And just broadly, we should be considering the role of nuclear energy if we want any chance of reaching net zero. And that was also a sentiment shared by the head of the International Energy Agency, when I asked, does net zero need nuclear? He gave me a wink. So I think it's very clear when you're at these sort of events that the rest of the world is going nuclear. And it doesn't make sense for a country like Australia, which is going to be having floating small modular reactors for our national security, not to consider those same small modular reactors for our energy security, on top of the fact that we have great nuclear expertise and also the largest uranium reserves in the world.
Will Shackle, so great to chat to you. Thanks for staying up late there in Dubai. Thanks so much, mate. We've got one sensible Australian and 49 clowns wandering around Dubai. Seriously, it was only 2 years ago at COP26 that Scott Morrison ignored the advice of this show, which was, if you want to get to net zero, go nuclear, and subsequently lost the next election. Peter Dutton is now saying a nuclear policy will be happening under the next coalition government. That's great news, because that coalition government is only 18 months away, in my opinion. There we go. Lots more coming up. Rita's reality check. We've got Andrew Timmings talking to us about the Free Speech Union. Alex Antic, lots more here on Outsiders. Do not go away. See you in 18.
You're watching Outsiders with your hosts, Rowan Dean, James Morrow, and I'm Rita Panahi. We've got plenty of lefty lunacy and wackademia to bring you shortly, including a school bringing back segregation in the name of diversity, of course. But first, let's check in with the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, who has just withstood another coordinated attack from activists claiming that he and his social media site X, formerly Twitter, are anti-Semitic, leading to an advertiser boycott from the likes of Disney and Apple and many more. Of course, these attacks against Musk and X have absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism. If that were the case, they'd be boycotting Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram. Have you seen the genuinely anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli content on those sites? Or what about Chinese-owned TikTok, which continues to poison the minds of youngsters in the West with far-left lunacy? Only last week, it was trending an Osama bin Laden love-in. Yes, really. No, anyone with a semblance of sense knows that the attacks against Musk and X are about pressuring him to reinstate the censorship and suppression of conservatives, to ban or shadow ban those who pose a risk to the Democrats and their chances of re-election. This attack against free speech is not new, and this week author, investigative reporter Michael Schellenberger gave further testimony about how social media sites conspired with politicians and government agencies to not only suppress free speech, but to deliberately spread disinformation to influence elections.
9 months ago, I testified and provided evidence to the subcommittee about the existence of a censorship industrial complex, a network of government agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, government contractors, and big tech media platforms that conspired to censor ordinary Americans and elected officials alike for holding disfavored views. I regret to inform the subcommittee today that the scope, power, and law-breaking of the censorship industrial complex are even worse than we had realized back in March. Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and other big tech companies are privately owned, people point out, and free to censor content. And government officials are free to point out wrong information, they argue. But the First Amendment prohibits the government from abridging freedom of speech. The Supreme Court has ruled that the government may not induce, encourage, or promote private persons to accomplish what is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. And there's now a large body of evidence proving that the government did precisely that. What's more, the whistleblower who delivered the CTIL files to us says that its leader, a quote-unquote former British intelligence analyst, was quote-unquote in the room at the Obama White House in 2017 when she received the instructions to create a counter-disinformation project to, quote, stop a repeat of 2016.
That's why they continue to attack the only social media site that provides something approaching a level playing field, a site that isn't going to be bullied into censoring scientists, for example, warning about the devastating impact of lockdowns, or completely disappear a legitimate, accurate story about Hunter Biden's laptop, which detailed the Biden family's dodgy business dealings. So far, Elon Musk has refused to fall in line with every other social media site to censor and suppress conservative voices. Remember, before he took over Twitter, the site banned the sitting US President Donald Trump, but allowed the mad mullahs of Iran to spew anti-Semitic bile on the site day and night. And there was no advertiser bans happening then. This week, during an interview for the New York Times Dealbook Summit, Elon Musk made it clear that he wasn't going to be bullied by activists or advertisers.
You don't want them to advertise?
No.
What do you mean?
If somebody's going to try to blackmail me with advertising, blackmail me with money, go yourself.
But
go yourself. Is that clear? I hope it is. Hey, Bob.
Hi, Bob. That's Disney's CEO, Bob Iger, who a few years ago was wanting to buy Twitter, but is now leading boycotts instead of focusing on his own faltering business, which is facing enormous brand damage due to its relentless leftist activism. Indeed, folks are boycotting Disney, and Elon Musk touched on that too.
But you recognize that some of those people are going to say that they didn't feel comfortable on the platform. And I just wonder and ask you and think about that for a second.
Tell it to the judge.
But the judge is going to be...
The judge is the public.
And you think that the public is going to say that Disney is making a mistake?
Yes.
And they're going to boycott Disney?
They already are.
They already are. Yes, Disney is beginning to wake up to the consumer backlash. It's hard to ignore the numbers, including losing millions of subscribers. And as The Hill reported this week, in a new corporate disclosure, Disney acknowledges that its controversial political and social agenda is costing the company and shareholders. Disney has reportedly lost $1 billion just on 4 of its recent woke movie flops, productions denounced by many critics as pushing political agendas or storylines. Yes, ordinary folks are sick of handing over their hard-earned to companies that hate them and hate their values, and companies that produce substandard entertainment products that appear to prioritise political messaging over entertainment. And as Musk said, they are sick of the corporate virtue signalling from those who pretend to do good while being anything but.
The reality of goodness, not the perception of it. And what I see all over the place is people who care about looking good while doing evil.
It's something Australian companies should keep in mind, including the long list that backed The Voice and poured a great deal of money into the scam. Consumers will only cop so much before they punish you for trying to influence political and social outcomes that have absolutely nothing to do with the running of your business.
Well done, Rita. And that list of Australian companies who should be getting very nervous about the way they played the woke card. They deserve the backlash when it comes along. Rita, there was also this week an interesting debate between Gavin Newsom, who's the Governor of California, and Ron DeSantis, who we've always said, would be great as a US president. But it wasn't actually a presidential debate. Just tell us about it and what happened.
Well, yes, the governors of California and Florida. It was fascinating to watch. And I've got to say, you don't have to be a conservative. I think anyone who watched that objectively would tell you that DeSantis cleared the floor with him. Newsom just looked like a fool. But there were a couple of moments that I think really just illustrate the dominance of DeSantis. Let's just have a look.
This is a map of San Francisco. There's a lot of plots on that. You may be asking, what is that plotting? Well, this is an app where they plot the human feces that are found on the streets of San Francisco. And you see how almost the whole thing is covered, because that is what has happened in one of the previous greatest cities this country's ever had, except when a communist dictator comes to town. Then they cleaned up the streets. I was talking to a fella who had made the move from California to Florida, and he was telling me that Florida is much better governed, safer, better budget, lower taxes, all this stuff. And he's really happy with the quality of life. And then he paused and he said, by the way, I'm Gavin Newsom's father-in-law. So we do count Gavin's in-laws as some of the people that have fled California and come to the state of Florida.
Outstanding.
Fantastic.
But, despite the destruction he's overseen in California, Gavin is probably going to be a Democrat presidential candidate.
And this is the thing that actually, I know there's some really funny gags in that and some great lines. I think DeSantis, put on a very good show, probably one of the better shows we've seen from him in quite some time. Maybe being out of the sort of the spotlight of the whole fight with Trump has been good for him there. But the thing about Gavin Newsom is he is absolutely. Did you see that smiling narcissistic performance that he put on there?
A Californian with a narcissistic smile?
I know.
Come on.
But I mean, that is exactly the sort of person that the Democrats will run, and they will try to win because he has no principles, and he will do exactly to the United States what he has done to California. Mark my words.
And he is, just about everything he said during that debate was a verifiable lie. It was just incredible, the ease with which he lies and gaslights. But as you saw, he's got a lot of advantages. I mean, not only the fact that Democrats love him, he's a good-looking, he's young, he's well-spoken. Yeah, what he says doesn't have much substance, but you can see him just getting the media adoration
he would get, and I mean, there's a lot of talk about, and I keep saying I don't think Biden's going to be the guy on the ticket. I don't think it'll be Newsom either this year, but watch out 2028.
Down the track.
But because he's the sort of guy who the media will love, and they'll say the torch is passed to a new generation, and Democrats are so cultish now that they will vote against their own interests in a place like California and all these other big cities where they keep voting in Democrats who are destroying the joint, and they say, no, it's fine because we're Democrats, and anything bad that happens to us, we deserve it. So bring it on.
I'm going to jump in there. We'll carry on this discussion later.
What will be, just before, he will be treated by the media like the white Barack Obama. He is going to be that beloved. The campaign will be absolutely enormous. And when we've got a little bit of time later in the program, let's talk about the absolute cesspit that is Chicago.
Yes,
absolutely.
Can we please?
Okay, well, we mentioned free speech there. Elon Musk fighting for free speech with Twitter. Our next guest is Andrew Timmings, who's a professor and author who has brought to these shores the Free Speech Union. Now, the Free Speech Union in Britain is run by Toby Young, who you will have seen on Outsiders. He's an editor of The Spectator magazine. There is also a free speech union in New Zealand, which Jonathan Ayling runs, which has done great work there. We need one in Australia. It started this week. I urge you to join it, to look into it, because the whole point of the Free Speech Union is to help people in everyday life who are cancelled for whatever reasons, simply for expressing a point of view. Andrew, great to see you. Thanks for coming here on the show. I was honoured to be your MC at the Free Speech Union launch in Melbourne the other evening. It was a great night. Tell us why the Free Speech Union is needed here in Australia now.
I mean, the bottom line is we are under attack. And when I say we, I don't just mean people like myself of the right. There are individuals on the left whose speech is also under attack. The Free Speech Union is a nonpartisan organization. We protect everyone's speech, everyone's lawful and protected speech. And there are so many instances these days over the last few years of egregious violations of individuals' right to free speech. And I'm not just talking about universities or journalists. I'm talking about teachers and taxi drivers who maybe post the wrong thing on Twitter and suddenly get a call from Human Resources saying, we'd like to have a chat. There is a dire need for a union that will come to people's help, that will come to people when they need help and provide them with the assistance so that they know that they're not alone in their fight.
James.
Tell us about some of the wins the Free Speech Union has chalked up in other countries, and what are some analogs to sort of current fights that we might be seeing today in Australia?
Well, the Free Speech Union, as Rowan said, has a history in the UK. There are a number of academics in the UK right now. I would say primarily the TERFs, the transition radical feminists, who have come under fire from their universities and are being supported by the Free Speech Union in the UK. There are a number of recent wins in New Zealand. There was a case of an anaesthetist who was almost outed publicly for some tweets that he or she made anonymously on Twitter, that the Free Speech Union came to their defense. In Australia, there's any number of cases that are going on right now. I mean, the way I like to think about this is a bit like an iceberg. You have above the water, the very visible cases, the Moira Deemings, the Peter Ridds, et cetera, people who are known to have been canceled for what they've said. But below the water is what you don't see, and that is a much bigger mass of people who self-censor, people who are afraid to express themselves, not just on Twitter, but in their workplaces, and a large number of people who have been canceled but simply don't have a voice to let others know that they've been canceled. So there is the value of the Free Speech Union. You're not alone. You have people behind you, you have people with you, and you have people with resources who can help you.
Rita.
So is it like a union? You have to be a member, paid up member to utilise your services and get your support if someone tries to cancel you?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We are a member-driven organisation like any other union, but we are unlike any other union. I think we all know that most trade unions, especially in this country, are vehicles of wokeism. I think they've long since abandoned the idea of their existence to bargain for wages in favor of the need to push a particular narrative, a woke narrative, so to speak. Whereas traditional unions are, as they say, they claim to be interested in protecting your wages. The Free Speech Union is interested in protecting your right to free speech, which, in my view, is a currency that's equally valuable, if not more valuable than a dollar, than your wages.
And Andrew, you mentioned Moira Deeming. She was there at the launch. So was Peter Ridds. So was Holly Lawford-Smith. All have been cancelled by their universities or cancelled by the political parties. But the key thing, from my opinion, I guess, is that the Free Speech Union is there for those people, as you mentioned, below the surface, who run foul of an HR department or colleagues, turn on them because they've expressed a point of view, a political point of view or a cultural point of view, and they get into all sorts of trouble. You there as the Free Speech Union, you will have lawyers and other people, correct, who are there to help these people. Am I right? And they need to contact you.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. We have a team of people that are there to help. We are here to defend liberty. It is liberty and freedom that made this country great. I don't think people ask that question of what made this country great. It's not the natural resources. It is the fact that we have had liberty and freedom to express ourselves, and that is under threat, dramatic threat at the moment. It's important because liberty enables creativity, creativity enables problem solving, and problem solving enables economic growth. So it's not just about speech. There are wider implications to what we're doing. We think that speech is the most fundamental right, the right to say something or the right not to say something. And we are here to defend it until the end.
Andrew Timming, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. And if you want to join the Free Speech Union, find out more about it. They need people to get behind it. It's gone gangbusters in the UK and New Zealand. We want to see the same thing happen here in Australia. Go online to freespeech.org.au. And after the break, your favourites, Wokeism and Lefty Lunacy. Don't go anywhere. Back in a tick. Thank you so much for watching Outsiders each and every Sunday morning. We certainly do appreciate you being here with us. Now, speaking of free speech, someone who was a great believer in free speech and who was cancelled himself, one of the great Australians, was, of course, Barry Humphries. I've got a book out this week, The Many Lives of Barry Humphries. You can pre-order it for Christmas. It comes out this week. Go to wilkinsonpublishing.com.au. It's a great read. Lots of politics, lots of Barry Humphries, lots of humour, lots of laughs in there. Some great stories. Now, Wokeism. Rita, the Sydney Vice-Chancellor, Mark Scott, this was the bloke who ran the ABC, arguably into the ground for a decade or so. Now appears to be doing much the same in the wokeness of Sydney University. Explain it to us,
Well,
Rita.
you'll be thrilled to know that Sydney University has released its anti-racism statement, because we've just been waiting for that with bated breath. And Sydney's largest and oldest university is going to be investigating its own history of racism. It wants to decolonise itself and also engage in a truth-telling process. This is part of their anti-racism statement that you would think right now what we're seeing with the virulent anti-Semitism on college campuses, not just in the US, but right here in Australia, that they should actually be reflecting on how they got to this point, not engaging in more behaviour that's going to make the situation worse. Because the way we got to this point is by this far left lunacy, this echo chamber where any dissenting views are demonised, where no one can cope with anything that isn't fit their worldview. They need a safe space from conservatives. And instead of reflecting on how damaging that is, James, they're doubling down.
Well, they're doubling down and they're using some of the, most ridiculous woke language, about anti-racism and decolonizing. This is all warmed over stuff from the United States that, has come and gone in and out of academic fashion, long ago. And now finally they're picking it up here. But I mean, the University of Sydney has really increasingly gone from being one of our premier sandstone institutions to quite a joke. I mean, because really much more what it's about these days seems to be about, churning out and making money for foreign students. Rather than actually educating people, particularly at the undergraduate level, it must be said. So this is just, more of the same from Mark Scott. He used to chair the ABC. Now he's at University of Sydney doing...
How much does he get paid?
Quite a bit, and we're paying.
It would be, if not $1 million, it'll be up close to...
And I just have to say, too, on these universities, too, on the foreign students thing, all of these universities, not just University of Sydney, we've got this huge problem with housing and everything, and there are huge problems that this mass of students coming through the country is putting on everybody else so they can make money out of it. And they are kicking up an almighty stink at the idea of having to pay a bit of a levy to contribute to the infrastructure and the burdens that their money-making schemes are putting on the rest of us.
And they're making this money from the overseas students, and it's become now a way of getting residency in this country as well. We can discuss that another time. But also, they're putting Australian students into debt for junk degrees. There are so many degrees that do not actually lead to any sort of meaningful employment.
Well, they don't. There's no jobs. Gender, rubbish.
If you want to study that, all good and well, but one, the taxpayer shouldn't be subsidising it, and the students shouldn't be sold false hope. So they should be told, this is the history of this particular course. 80% of our graduates are not actually working in that field. They may be your local barista, but they're not working in gender dance studies or whatever the hell we're giving degrees
gender
out for.
Geopolitics or whatever it is. Yeah. Now, let's decolonise. Let's start the decolonising process of Sydney University by decolonising Mark Scott. Mark Scott, why don't you resign? Why don't you resign and you go away? And by the way, I think we should also decolonise anyone of Anglo-Celtic or Anglo-Saxon heritage who donates money to Sydney University must stop today. Any families that have been donating money to Sydney University because their parents or grandparents or whatever went to that university must stop now donating any money to that university. And anybody who wants to send their kids to Sydney University, if you're of Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Celtic heritage, do not, because you are not welcome there. So that is what you are doing, Mark Scott. You are destroying one of our great institutions, as you helped destroy one of our other great institutions, arguably. But there you go. That's what the woke always do. Let's move on to look at... more university stuff. We've got divided by race. What's been happening in Chicago, Rita?
Oh, well, yes. This is a college town near Chicago, north of Chicago, and they've had fairly wide gaps in academic achievement between their different races, the black students, Latino students and the white students. So to overcome this, they've decided we're going to have voluntary segregation. So they're going to segregate classrooms by race. It's not forced. But again, we are, in the name of so-called diversity, progress, anti-racism, going backwards, going back into sort of 1940s, 1950s mindsets. And instead of actually looking at, OK, what are the reasons why these particular student groups are underperforming? How can we get them to reach their potential? They go straight down this racial route and dividing people by race.
Well, Rita, I was just surprised to hear you say that Democrats might be in favour of segregation. Oh, wait, they've always been the party of segregation.
Yes.
But can I tell you about a crazy story here? At Brown University, one of the wokest of the woke Ivy League universities. And I tell you what, American college campuses these days, they've become bigger Hamas hideouts than Al-Shifa Hospital. The president of the university was trying to give some whole speech about, we're coming together and, all of the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and all of that, the whole both sides routine.
Yeah.
And she had a line in her speech, and she's giving the speech, and on the fly, the original text said that this should be a campus where anybody feels safe to wear a yarmulke or a hijab. And because the Palestinian, the pro-Hamas mob there were all screaming at her, she simply said, safe to wear a hijab. Eliminated all references, and there were other references too, to Jewish students feeling safe. 2 or 3 references, she took them all out. What message does that say? Jews, you're not welcome here in the Ivy League. Again, this is where the Ivy League was 100 years ago, and now they're back there.
Jews aren't welcome, and I tell you, these anti-racism policies, supposedly anti-racist, they're actually virulently racist. They're not good for Jews, they're not good for the white students, and they're not good for Asian students as well. And arguably, it's the Asian students who are most disadvantaged because despite their academic achievements, they're not getting entry into some of these Ivy League colleges, like the likes of Harvard, because they want to boost other minority groups. The Asians are too successful, they're too good, so they want to boost the other ones. And there's the graphs on this where if you say get 90 out of 100, the chances of getting entry if you're Latino or black compared to if you're white or Asian are just completely...
That whole approach is just insane. But we've got some good news here for you on Outsiders, for those men out there who've been wondering where to buy tampons for themselves. Men who menstruate now have their very own tampon supplier, which it's about time. No, I won't say what I was about to say.
No, please don't, Robin.
It is about time that we had this, don't you think? So there you go. This is spotting a gap in the... There's so many gags I could do. Sorry, a gap in the market for... So anyway, there you go. This is what the woke world is bringing us. Men who menstruate now have tampons. Great story there. We've also got...
Will they be in the women... feminine hygiene aisle, or we're going to get rid of those two?
That's a good point. We will contemplate that after the break. We will tell you. Coming back shortly here on Outsiders. You're watching Outsiders with Rita Panahi, with James Morrow and myself, Rowan Dean. Some breaking news now from Paris, France, where one person has been killed and another injured in a stabbing attack. The assailant reportedly shouting out Allahu Akbar before the incident. France's Interior Minister says the assailant has been arrested. And so it goes on. When they came to power 18 months ago, the Albanese government, and in particular Penny Wong, betrayed every Jewish person in Australia. Penny Wong announced that Australia would from now on use the term, quote, occupied Palestinian territories to describe the territories in the West Bank and Gaza. She also announced that the federal government would no longer recognise West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And equally appallingly, Penny Wong doubled the amount of Australian tax dollars, your money, sent to the much-maligned United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the awkward-sounding UNRWA, for Palestinian refugees. $20 million of your money, which she has increased even further in the last few weeks as aid to the Palestinians. Well, it seems I was right to be appalled. This week we learned that Germany and other European countries are looking to freeze any further funding going to UNRWA. 2 reports published following the October 7th barbaric rapes, murders, massacres by Hamas, wait for this, determined that over 100 Hamas terrorists who took part in those bloody murders and rapes are graduates of UNRWA schools. And at least 14 teachers and staff members of UNRWA schools, this is United Nations Relief Works Agency schools, celebrated the massacre on social media, including one post describing that day of brutality, carnage, cruelty, rape and murder and torture as an unforgettable, glorious morning. That's where your tax dollars are going, thanks to Penny Wong and the Albanese Labor government, to UNRWA. Now, I'll get on to that unforgettable, glorious morning in a moment. But first, here's a brief history discussion, courtesy of the brilliant, although controversial, British journalist and writer for The Times newspaper, Melanie Phillips, who I was honoured to share a stage with here in Sydney a few years ago. Unlike the ill-informed Penny Wong, Melanie Phillips is actually extremely well-versed in the history of Israel and the land known to some as Palestine. This week she wrote a superb piece entitled "Why Israel is Entitled in Law to the West Bank." As Melanie writes, there has never been any such thing in law as Palestinian land. There never was a state of Palestine. When the Romans conquered the Jewish kingdom of Judea, destroyed the Jewish temple, and drove the Jews of Judea into exile, the Romans renamed it Palestina in an attempt to erase its Jewish identity. When the last colonial occupier of the land, the Ottoman Empire, fell after the First World War, the international community that carved up the Middle East to create a number of new states and countries kept the name Palestine to describe the territory which was now to be recreated as the homeland of the Jewish people. You can see on the map there, on the screen, Jewish Palestine and Arab Palestine. Melanie then goes on further. This was cemented at the 1920 San Remo Conference and given the force of international treaty law by the League of Nations in the 1922 Mandate for Palestine. Britain then sliced some 70% off this land to create Transjordan, or what is now known as Jordan. And Palestine consisted of what is now Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Melanie says, to make this quite clear, only the Jews were given the legal right to settle the land in what is now Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. That right has never been abrogated. The 1922 League of Nations mandate was ratified by the United Nations Charter of 1945, which pledged to uphold the agreements entered into by its predecessor, the League of Nations. The legally binding principles entitling the Jewish people to settle all this land were subsequently further codified in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties of 1969, which confirmed that it included Judea and Samaria, i.e. the West Bank, and Gaza. Between 1922 and 1948, writes Melanie, quote, when people referred to the Palestinians, they were referring to the Jews. One reason why the term, quote, occupied Palestinian territories, unquote, is a nonsense, take note, Penny Wong, is that, as Melanie writes, quote, the areas in question were never Palestinian land, but were always legally designated for Jews alone to be entitled to settle, end of quote. When the UN finally declared the land of Israel, the Arab armies immediately attacked. We know this. This was the Israel-Arab War of 1948, where the Israelis were forced to defend themselves from annihilation. This 1982 documentary spells out what happened next.
One of the enormous anomalies and discrepancies that arises in the partition of the Palestinian Mandate into a Jewish state of Israel and an Arab state, which in this case was ruled by Jordan, is the fact that there were refugee problems on both sides. On the one hand, the Jewish communities of Lebanon, of Syria, of Iraq, of Tunis, of Libya, of Morocco were expelled, and 700,000 Jewish refugees came to Israel between 1948 and 1950. One of the success stories of our time is the ability of the small Israeli population of 800,000 to to absorb this massive wave of refugees and integrate them as citizens of Israel.
The Palestinian refugee problem remained the way it is for more than 3 generations because the Arab countries wished it to be that way. None of them was willing to accept the fact of Israel. So they kept alive a fiction that Israel would be eliminated and therefore the refugees should sit where they were until the day would come when they would be able to overthrow Israel and retrieve their nation. Now, since '67, at least, it has been clear to all the Arab countries that that was not going to happen.
Melanie Phillips then goes on at length about various legal opinions written about all this and the wars that followed before concluding. I urge you to read her article on Substack. Before concluding that Israel is not in, quote, illegal occupation of the Palestinian territory. She says that phrase, illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories, is legally illiterate. Yes, Penny Wong, legally illiterate. The Jews are the only people entitled in law to those territories. Melanie concludes, get over it, she says. Now, the fact that we are financing UNRWA is a vile obscenity. As I said, 2 reports show over 100 of the murderers and rapists of Hamas were educated by UNRWA, with 14 of UNRWA's current staff and teachers celebrating the unforgettable, glorious morning of Saturday, October 7th. The morning, and please, if you're squeamish, I apologise in advance for the graphic description. This unforgettable, glorious morning led to this.
We saw women who were shot in the eyes, in the face, many times in sensitive places, just to mutilate them. Our team were the ones to open the female body bags. It was indescribable. There was blood everywhere. Their underwear was often very bloody. The back of the heads were crushed and brains were coming out. One time we were warned, this woman has no legs. Her legs were cut off. The faces had grimaces. Their mouths were contorted in pain. These women still had blood dripping from their ears, blood dripping from other places. And suddenly there was a flash of color. And what was it? It was these beautiful, beautiful manicures on these young girls. And we were taken aback, and that touched us so deeply because we're all women and we know that a manicure is a sign of such hope. We gave them the honor that they did not get when they were murdered. We knew that we were probably going to be the last people to see these women, and it was very important to us to honor them and to love them, and we did.
And here are just some of those Jewish women and girls murdered on October the 7th. There were many, many more. UNRWA educates people who grow up to become murderers and rapists, and it is staffed by people, teachers and others, who celebrated that barbarity and savagery. And Penny Wong and Labour send our tax dollars to UNRWA. UNRWA is run by the United Nations. And here is the Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Women, an organisation called UN Women, repeatedly refusing to condemn Hamas.
It's not just condemning sexual violence against women and in any war in general. It's specifically what occurred on October 7th, perpetrated by Hamas.
Indeed. UN Women always supports impartial, independent investigations into any serious allegations of gender-based or sexual violence. And within the UN family, these investigations are led by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And just to provide a little bit of context in terms of UN Women's role, UN Women specifically provides and has extensive knowledge on gender-based violence and provides and supports investigations as we do with all UN investigations. And so consequently, in this context, And within the UN system, it is the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, which for us has the mandate to investigate all alleged violations.
And on and on. In this context, the UN system. But yes, last night, UN women did finally condemn Hamas. It's only taken them 8 weeks. Don't the left just make you want to vomit? And let's chat to great friend of this show, Senator Alex Antic from South Australia. Alex, always great to have you on the show. The South Australian Labor government, which I'm pleased to say you're keeping a close eye on so that the rest of us don't have to. The South Australian Labor government has decided to scrap, or appears to be scrapping, ANZAC Day, Christmas Day and whatever else they feel like through a new act. Tell us about it.
Well, thanks, Rowan. Good to be here on a Sunday morning, doing the work, watching things so you don't have to is my middle name. So the state Labor government here is one of those very tasks of which I've been tasked, as are the state Libs in the upper house who are doing a great job keeping them honest. They're the ones actually who flagged this. This is the Public Holidays Bill 2023, which was introduced by the state Labor government here. It repeals the old Holidays Act. It's a piece of legislation that basically bricks in which public holidays there are, and as we've discovered this week, what they're called, because this week, Labor moved to put that bill up without any references to the following: Australia Day, ANZAC Day or Christmas Day. Those holidays are now known as the 26th of January, the 25th of April and the 25th of December, in a consecutive order. Now, they say, don't be silly, we're not trying to cancel the names or cancel these days or anything of the sort. That's just crazy talk, except when the state Libs led by Nicola Centofanti and Heidi Girolamo, MLC here, tried to put those names back in by way of amendments this week. They said, don't be silly, we're not doing that. Why would we do that? So you have to ask yourself the question, if it's not about cancelling those 3 great holidays, and if it's not paying disrespect to our ANZACs and the ANZAC legend and Christmas and Australia Day, then what is this all about? Why would they not allow those names to go back in? I can say that the same sort of tin ear we see from the Labor Party we saw on The Voice, we're now seeing in relation to these days. The message is clear. When you're voting Labor, you are getting the hard left fringes of the Labor Party who insist on pushing these culture wars type issues through over and above the real issues which are facing Australians and South Australians too, of course, which are cost of living, all these sorts of things. Just had $400 million spent on The Voice. South Australia still has that Voice legislation at state level, by the way, and this is the sort of stuff we're getting shoveled up. This is alarming and shameful.
Rita.
Well, on that state-based Voice in South Australia, how is that coming along? Can we expect more division and more woke politics emanating from that union, as well as what we expect from Labor every day?
Yeah, look, well, I mean, they're not backing down from it. The state Labor Party here, despite overtures from our side of the fence, and the state Libs here who have opposed it and opposed the federal one as well, I should say, are not backing down. They are simply going full steam ahead, and we're expecting that it'll become law early in the new year next year. And, they had a ceremonial sitting on a Sunday about, I think, 6 months ago, which almost nobody turned up to. They apparently had to get on the phones and call staffers to come in and sit there and populate the area because everyone was so excited about it, on it goes. The madness goes on. But rest assured, the shine is coming off the SS Malinauskas and the SS Albanese in a big way, and people are starting to work this mob out.
James.
I want to move on to another issue that came up in Parliament this week. Katie Gallagher was talking about digital IDs, which is, of course, something that they've been dreaming about since the days of the Australia card. Have a look at what the senator said here.
I cannot believe that those opposite are going to side with people who are going to pretend this bill is a whole range of things that it absolutely isn't. So when they say it's mandatory, it's not. When they say it's going to steal your identity or it's a big government conspiracy, it is not.
It is not.
It is not. It is not. Alex Antic, she says it is not. But you say otherwise. And not only you said otherwise, but a lot of viewers and readers of X, formerly Twitter, have blown this up with a context note. Tell us about it.
Yeah, look, well, if Katie says so, then I'm all on board. There's no problem. Then I must have got it wrong. Everyone must have got it wrong. So, no, look, the fact of the matter is this is legislation. People that aren't aware of this is, I think, one of the biggest stories in Australian politics over the last period. I mean, this is going to fundamentally change everything we do, and this is going to become an enormous impost on freedom. People 40 years ago pushed against the Australia card in numbers. We need people to do the same thing here with this digital ID. This will set up a framework whereby you can only be identified by way of your digital footprint, whether it be by your biometrics, so like when you hold your iPhone up and your facial recognition goes into the phone, that sort of style of system. And they're saying at the moment, no, it's all just voluntary. You don't have to worry about that. It's not going to be mandatory. Just like, remember that safe and effective jabs that we used to get? They were only voluntary as well to start off with. And then before you know it, you couldn't get a job without one. So, I mean, if you believe that, then I've got a nice big wire coat hanger over the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which I'm going to sell you this afternoon. This is going to become fundamental to everything you do in this country, including at some point getting a Medicare number, going to hospital, getting a bank loan. And, you know, I can tell you right now, and I'll just get my tinfoil hat out because we're running out of conspiracy theories, by the way. They all seem to come true. So we're going to find a few new ones. How about this one? If you want to have a look at what our future looks like, look at the Chinese Communist Party's social credit system and the way they do things over there, because that is the system that is coming to you and us and all Australians as a result of this digital ID system. There will be a time in future where you simply can't get on a plane because your social credit score has dropped because you jaywalked in order to get to the airport and you can't buy a ticket, and your bank account with its digital currency is linked to this digital ID. This is a digital snare trap. It has to be opposed. And I think there is now until the 19th of January to get online, look up the submissions. The government's taking submissions. Australians need to be aware of what's happening because this is more serious than the Honourable Senator Katie Gallagher will tell you. She also said in that clip, by the way, and the great Senator from Queensland, Matt Canavan, got up and corrected her because I think she did say something along the lines of, this has nothing to do with the digital ID or words to that effect. And he got up and said, hang on, it's the digital ID bill. What are you talking about? So, I mean, it's just I don't know. I think the Senator needs a Christmas holiday. I don't understand.
Rita?
Well, it's been a rough week for poor Katie Gallagher because I think we showed it up on the screen there. She also got a disinformation note on her post. This is what's called a community notes on Twitter, people correcting an assertion she was making. And I'm interested in how that works with this government that seems to be telling us disinformation is a threat to democracy and that's why we need this disinformation bill that's going to apply to everybody. Where is that particular bill and how do you think the upper house is going to handle that? Are we going to be saddled with that?
Yeah, look, I think they're both coming. That one's disappeared. The misinformation bill has disappeared off the radar. It received, I'm told, 23,000 submissions at a similar stage or an earlier stage with an exposure draft. So, you know, I mean, people don't write and put in submissions when they love a piece of legislation, I can assure you. That I think they're only releasing about 2,500 of those, by the way, because it's, you know, all the usual reasons, too much bureaucratic red tape and, you know, they don't have time and resources and all that sort of thing. But people are onto this. The misinformation bill, a bit like the digital ID bill, are both of great concern to the Australian people. I don't know where that's up to. It's been put back on the shelf. I expect we will probably in the new year see a slightly less worse version of the misinformation and disinformation bill. But ultimately, these are the same bills which are being introduced all across the West, all at the behest of big corporates and the World Economic Forum, I have to say, to get that tinfoil hat on again. This is a bigger picture push than just Australia itself. We are being caught in a snare trap with these pieces of legislation. Pretty soon there won't be any avenues for free speech. And if those of us who wish to speak it, then we will find our social standing dropping like a proverbial stone.
Alex Antic, always great to have you here, Senator for South Australia. You do a great job there in Parliament in protecting our liberties and freedoms. We need the Liberal Party to come out and say that they will oppose this thing. I'm saying that Dutton will be the next Prime Minister. We need to keep our freedoms and safeties. That's the common sense approach that everyday Australians want. Thanks for the great work. And as you say, we've got to get everyday Australians to get online and oppose this idiotic idea, yet another ideological bit of idiocy from Labor. Thanks so much, Alex Antic. After the break, James's donkey votes. Plus, we'll speak to Michael Welsh about the riots in Dublin and the craziness going on over there. Don't go away. Back in a tick.
Hello, you're watching Outsiders with the Holly Jolly, Rowan Dean, and Rita Mistletoe Panahy. And a special shout out to all the viewers out there, like Suzanne from Windsor, who continue to make this show the greatest show on Sky News. And in a moment, I'm going to bring you some new and frankly disturbing details about the stabbing of Derek Chauvin, the cop whose killing of George Floyd touched off the 2020 Summer of Love riots, with a weird but I'm sure completely coincidental link to the FBI. But first, let's check in with the quite likely next president of the United States, Donald Trump, talking to voters in Iowa just about now about Joe Biden.
And I'm very glad they didn't give me any notes, because if I did, I would have been reading. I would have been saying, thank you, here's Biden. Thank you. I saw something the other day that was incredible. He's taking questions. And again, I wouldn't talk this way, but he indicted me. Can you imagine? I got indicted. I'd never heard. The Wharton School of Finance, they didn't have a subject on you get indicted. It wasn't like something you think about, right? My father, my mother and father, they're looking down. My son got indicted more than Alphonse Capone. Don't forget, Al Capone was the toughest, meanest guy. If you had dinner with him and if he smiled the wrong way, where he thought you were maybe smiling about him or mocking him, you were dead. You're a dead person. Scarface, you ever hear? Al Capone, Scarface. That was where the movie came from. He had a scar from here to here, and he didn't get that scar from playing tiddlywinks. Do we agree? He got indicted one time. I got indicted 4 times for nothing,
Love it.
Ah, yes, the comedy stylings of Donald J. Trump. Anyway, of course, it's Christmas time, and that can only mean one thing: the annual lighting of the White House Christmas tree. But this being the Biden administration, well, not everything's going to go to plan, right? I mean, look, it started off well enough with an event producer whipping up the hand-picked crowd to cheer their favorite president.
Stand by, applause. And applause, applause, applause.
Happy holidays. For over 100 years, we gather together to light the national Christmas tree.
Shades of the infamous please clap moment. Hey, by the way, has anyone seen Jeb Bush lately? Maybe he's doing events at the White House. But not one to stand on ceremony. The president got right into it.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
It's beautiful, Clark. God, you can only imagine the nervousness as he counted down. Is he going to remember 4? Is he going to remember 3? We also got to see, thanks to a technical glitch, the unsung hero and nemesis of the Biden administration in action. Watch the lower right-hand corner of your screen and you can actually see the teleprompter in action.
Bill and I are honored to welcome you to the National Christmas Tree Lighting. Thanks to Interior Secretary Deb Haaland and the National Park Service Foundation. They're the ones doing this. And a special thanks to tonight's host, Mickey.
And, of course, there was the usual exit stage left, or is it right? Well, I don't know. Which is it, Jill? This way, not that way. And did you notice the little jog he did too? It's because he's so fit and so vigorous. So much of a campaign trail disaster also waiting to happen there. Now, on to other matters. Earlier this week, former police officer Derek Chauvin was stabbed by a fellow inmate in a federal penitentiary where he is serving a sentence for killing career criminal George Floyd in 2020 in an encounter over an alleged counterfeit $20 note. Now, Floyd's death, you will recall, touched off weeks of riot and destruction across the United States. Egged on by the Black Lives Matter movement, resulted in at least 20 deaths and gave the world a look at how depraved media outlets like CNN really are when they gave us the glorious phrase, mostly peaceful protests. Now, here's interesting stuff, though. Details have emerged about the man who is alleged to have stabbed Chauvin with a homemade shiv in prison 22 times. Turns out the alleged stabber was someone named John Turshak. He's apparently of Czech heritage, but according to reports, he grew up in Los Angeles, got involved with drugs at a young age, and improbably, but whatever, hey, this is America, right, became a member of a Mexican drug gang that had cocaine as its stock and trade. Oh, and one other funny thing. He was also an FBI informant. Go back 20 years to when Turshak was given the 30-year sentence for a variety of crimes that landed him in the same jail that would eventually house Chauvin, and there's this report from the Los Angeles Times. In it, Turshak says that he committed crimes at the behest of the FBI. The article reporting on his sentence back in 2001 read, quote, John Turshak, 30, expressed bitter disappointment with his sentence. He told U.S. District Judge A. Howard Matz, I didn't commit those crimes for kicks. I did them because I had to if I wanted to stay alive. I told that to the FBI agents, and they just said, do what you have to do, unquote. Interesting. And he also had what he called duplicitous dealings with the FBI that saw him participate in a murder plot to try and kill another gang leader. Anyway, he sounds like a lovely fellow, but there's one final interesting detail here. According to the U.S. District Court filing on this stabbing of Chauvin, Turshak chose the date of the stabbing for the day after Thanksgiving, a.k.a. Black Friday, and told investigators that his, quote, attack was symbolic with the Black Lives Matter movement, unquote. Now, you don't have to be an expert in American or Californian race relations to know that this might be a bit of odd behavior from someone close to a Mexican drug gang. Mm-hmm. And to be sure, I am not sharing all of this to suggest that there's some sort of bizarre conspiracy with an FBI informant. Those FBI informants seem all over the place. And a member of a Mexican drug gang just happened to stab the cop who killed George Floyd because he wanted to stand up for African Americans. We know, come on, the FBI is completely apolitical and that Hispanics were great supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement. But as with other high-profile defendants you might be able to think of, it does seem like America's prison system needs to do a better job of keeping people safe.
Thanks, James. Well, the stabbing of 5 people in Ireland has inflamed dissatisfaction amongst the nation over rapidly increasing immigration. But police chiefs blamed rioting in Dublin city centre last week on a, quote, lunatic hooligan faction driven by a far-right ideology, end of quote. Joining us now to discuss this is author Michael Walsh. Michael, great to see you. So what's happening there in Ireland? So we had the stabbing and it's apparently far right if you in any way try to blame the riots that then followed on the questions surrounding immigration. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, everything in Ireland is far right that is not in lockstep agreement with the government media complex in Ireland. Ireland has a nominal two-party system which goes back to the treaty that you may recall from watching movies about Michael Collins and Eamon de Valera, which parties split over the treaty that eventually won partial independence from Britain. So they're called Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Effectively, they're the uniparty now. They are both in favor of what the government is in favor of. And they have formed a coalition government after the last election, since neither one of them could get a majority. And they are presently in coalition government with a very tiny party called the Green Party, which curiously enough with all of the major government ministries, including the environment, and has elements of the immigration in it as well. So it's a powder keg. I live on the west coast of Ireland in a house where my great-grandmother was born. I've restored it and brought property up and moved my family to Ireland. I have an Irish son-in-law. I have 2 Irish grandchildren and a third on the way, and I'm looking forward to seeing them very soon. But that's one version of immigration. The other version is the untrammeled, everyone can come in and is entitled to the most generous benefits in the European Union just on their say-so. They arrive with no passports, no papers, no nothing, and immediately demand housing, etc. Predominantly among them, although not the source of this current trouble, are the Ukrainians, who have been welcomed with open arms, even though, as I pointed out from time to time, that by welcoming Ukrainian men into Ireland, you are effectively supporting Putin, because those men are subject to the draft back home in the Ukraine. We haven't quite thought this whole thing through. But what happened in the stabbing of the day, and it's personal to me. I have 2, as I mentioned, 2 grandchildren, a third on the way, and my elder granddaughter goes to school in Dublin. She's a great schooler, like the victims of this particular stabbing. That was just the thing that set the simmering powder keg off. And the government has chosen to deal with it by basically cracking down on everyone who is opposed to immigration, as the term is understood in the political sense, and calling them far right, and asking for hate speech crimes, new laws. And it's a mess.
Michael, I saw Conor McGregor, the famous Irish UFC fighter, come out strongly. I think police are now investigating to see whether some of his statements breached hate laws, but he has been very, very outspoken about explaining where this anger comes from, and it's not just some far-right hooligan element. So I'm interested to see how he has suddenly become the voice of disaffected people. At the top of the show, we played a compilation of Irish politicians standing up in Parliament and just making the most absurd anti-white comments. Is there a self-loathing in Ireland? The people are voting for this. Is there a crisis in identity where they hate who they are?
Well, as I used to joke with my friend James, who's sitting next to you during the Australian lockdown, once a penal colony, always a penal colony, as far as Australia. And Ireland, once a slave state of the British, always a slave state. And in this case, we substituted 700 years of slavery under England for a few years, a few decades of freedom, and then rushed back into the embrace of new slavers. They live in Belgium, of all places. Who had Ireland gets taken over by Brussels on their bingo card. And Irish politicians now are wholly employed by the European Union. So they don't care what the Irish people think. They answer, and in their lights, understandably, to the EU and Belgium, and they're constantly citing EU laws over Irish sovereignty. Wow. Many years ago, I was flying back to Ireland, and a woman, Irish woman next to me, said to me at that point, this was in the 90s, "I feel like we're losing my country." And I said, "What do you mean feel like? You already lost it. The minute you joined the European Union, you lost your sovereignty."
100%.
And
James.
that's what happened. All of this comes from that.
And so is that where then, I mean, I feel sort of like with Ireland, it feels like kind of the test case for a lot of other countries right now. And that if you look at this law that they're pushing through on hate speech, where essentially, you know, memes on your phone, the cops can look at your phone and say, hey, that's a hateful meme. You know, we don't like that. And you could wind up literally banged up for it. And I feel like this is almost the test model that they're trying it out in sort of a small country like Ireland to run it out in bigger jurisdictions, including, of course, Australia. Tell us about this hate speech law and how that would actually wind up working.
Well, the hate speech law has been proposed now for a few months. It's been set aside except that the government has used this protest by, quote, far-right hooligans in response to the stabbing of a little girl by what appears to have been an Algerian immigrant who had been deported, oddly enough, and then was rescued probably by the NGOs who are the do-gooder external forces all over Ireland. They're quite powerful. And they eventually got him citizenship. Well, people were finally just completely fed up with this. But to crack down on the people, remember, the people don't matter. They're animals on a farm. And Ireland is viewed by the EU as a kind of backwater with a lot of empty space, because after all, the Brits emptied us out from 8 million to 4 million people during the famine. But, as John Cleese says in Fawlty Towers, just don't mention the war. So we don't mention the famine. But there's a lot of space in Ireland. It's being used. I think you're absolutely right, James. It's being used as a test case in order to see how far they can push a country that doesn't really have a lot of pushback in it. So many of the Irish, like me and my family, and millions of us in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, in the United States, are immigrants not by choice, but of necessity during the 19th century, particularly. And so Ireland is really defenseless, and because it doesn't have a real sense of its own nationhood other than its cultural Irishness, it's finding it hard to fight back. And also, Rita mentioned this, the politicians now have decided to adopt American terminology. That is, you're either white or you're not.
Exactly.
White
Exactly.
people, and not is good. So we literally have these discussions going on in Ireland where people say, why aren't there more black faces in television shows about 15th century Ireland?
Mike,
there weren't any. They look at you like you're crazy.
Exactly. Michael Walsh, great to chat to you. Sorry, I got to cut you off there. Chat to you for hours. Really great stuff. Thank you so much to reporting from Ireland there. Don't go anywhere. Ice Age Watch in a tick. Hello, you're watching Outsiders Weather and the Skeptics Ice Age Watch. This week is, of course, COP28, the climate change conference, the annual one, when 70,000 of the world's climate hypocrites jet set over to Dubai to lecture the rest of us how we shouldn't be flying in planes because of the damage we are doing to the environment. It would be fascinating to do a cost-benefit analysis on what all this climate dogma will actually cost us. Oh, hang on, somebody already has. According to climate believer Bjorn Lomborg, 2 new peer-reviewed papers have done a cost-benefit analysis on achieving net zero and, quote, containing global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Bjorn Lomborg describes the results as explosive. On his interpretation of the results, Lomborg claims the benefit of reaching net zero is calculated at $4.5 trillion a year. Woo! But the cost is a terrifying $26.8 trillion every single year, which adds up to a total loss of $1,800 trillion. Yes, $1,800 trillion over the century. On top of which, according to a report in Bloomberg, at this year's COP28, quote, the world's most developed nations will be told to curb our excessive appetite for meat. Nations that overconsume meat will be advised to limit their intake, while developing countries will need to improve their livestock farming. I bet they will. According to The Guardian, quote, for the first time at COP28, there will be a dedicated food day, and food, agriculture and water will be the focus of at least 22 major events in Dubai, and, quote, food systems must change, quote, animal farming for meat and dairy must be reined back, and, quote, significant reductions in meat and dairy consumption should absolutely be part of the commitments our nations make to addressing the climate crisis. COP28, by the way, according to the Daily Mail, quote, will have the biggest carbon footprint in the event's history. What appalling hypocrites. Here, of course, is the man we are sending over to Dubai, along with 48 climate-obsessed hypocrites. Sorry, typo, bureaucrats, whose job it will be to reduce your consumption of the classic Aussie meat pie. Reduce your consumption of our beloved snags and souvlaki. Reduce consumption of ribs and rumps. Yes, at COP28, Labor, the Labor government, will start the process of destroying the great Aussie barbecue in the name of saving the planet from climate change. Not to mention reducing our consumption of Australian cheeses and dairy and sounding the death knell for the great Aussie ice cream lurking in your freezer, where it is now being blamed for global warming. And speaking of freezing things, extraordinary November chills have been gripping Europe of late, with impressive early season snow totals to match. According to the climate skeptic Electroverse, Europe plunges to minus 34.5 degrees Celsius as heavy November snow sweeps Britain to Bulgaria. Cold thermometers in this Finnish village of Tulipio crashed to minus 34.5 degrees Celsius this week, while the daily max in Sala, in Finnish Lapland, failed to climb above minus 30 on Tuesday, which proved record-breaking for the month of November. My good friend Georgina sent me this message from her friend in Norway, quote, "We are still in November and it's just getting colder and colder, 29.8 below zero." In Germany, the early onset of winter has led to at least 2 deaths thanks to trees collapsing under the weight of snow. And in the UK, according to the BBC, in Scotland, temperatures dipped to minus 8 degrees Celsius, which is the UK's coldest November temperature in 13 years. And the UK Telegraph reported yesterday that temperatures would plummet to minus 10 degrees in the UK. Obviously, COP28 is now on. King Hypocrite III, sorry, typo, I mean King Charles III, won't be one of those shivering under the doona in his freezing London palace, because he is off in his private jet to Dubai, ignoring his solemn pledge not to mix in politics by giving a political speech at the COP28 conference on global warming, with his own staff of around 100, all no doubt whizzing in on private jets. Speaking of jetting to warmer climes, allow me to now bring you some good news about our own Great Barrier Reef. Watch closely now.
All set to go, Jan? All ready to go, Peter? Whoa! Okay, got my sea legs. I'm looking for that bleached coral.
And what do we hope to see out there?
Well, we'll go back to that area. We'll see if we can find that particular coral. It is possible that it has died.
So how do you find one piece of coral 80 kilometres out in the ocean? It's like a needle in a haystack, isn't it?
A bit of an idea of where it might be.
That piece of coral was officially dead, cactus, like the Norwegian blue parrot. Finished, gone to meet its maker.
It was assumed that the coral was going to die.
Right.
But what we saw was a picture of a branching acropora that had bleached white.
It's supposed to be dead. It was teeming with life. Okay, sure, there's plenty of fish in the sea and plenty of coral in the sea, but this looked like the real thing. John Brewer's most famous bit of coral, and it wasn't bleached white.
So this is the Coral Watch Coral Health Chart.
Yeah.
What colour do you think it was?
Okay, well, I described it in my head. It was cafe latte. As it has been explained to me, there are two coral colonies, one on top of each other. There's a lighter coloured branching colony on top of a darker brown flat, what they call plate coral colony. When the branches bleached, they went white. They have their colour back now. They're about an E3 on the colour chart. When Paul holds the colour chart against the bottom coral, I can see it's a D5 colour. I'm calling this multi-layered structure my cafe latte coral colony. I want to see it splashed on the front page of The Guardian. If only I had a Guardian photographer with me. And the full film with Peter Ridd, Jennifer Mara-Hasey, myself and others will be released by the IPA on ipa.org.au this coming Friday. You don't want to miss it. It's produced and directed by the great Jennifer Mara-Hasey, who Linda McCartney would no doubt call our very own seaside woman. Hyperbole, or hyperbole, extreme exaggeration as pronounced by Julia Gillard. Well, you can't go past, we are living in hyperbole at the moment. 2023 is virtually certain to be the hottest year in history. The hottest year in history. Enlighten me, James, how they would measure this, I wonder.
Well, it's apparently with a decibel meter because it's a deafening cacophony of measurements saying that is the hottest year on record. You know, this just feels like every single time you could have this really cold, wet, gross November, and I'm sure we're going to start seeing headlines. That was the hottest November we've had ever in Australia, guys.
Minus 10 in the UK.
Yeah.
Rita, Taylor Swift is apparently now something to be studied at university, better than gender and whatever, geos, whatever.
Or you can combine them, gender and storytelling, Taylor Swift style. So there's a bunch of universities, including Harvard, UCLA, Northeastern, that are capitalising on Taylor Swift's popularity amongst the Zoomers, and they're going to have classes in Taylor Swift. And then they want the average person to pay for their university debt. I mean, really, if you're going to study these junk courses with these junk units of study...
Well, we've got a bit of history, James. You've got a bit of history.
Yeah, look, they're going to go find a job with the big six Taylor Swift studying firms. You know, come on, it'll be fine. Now, the big study out of the UK now, which suggests, apparently, because, of course, all science must be in the service of politics, that women were better hunters when they were cavemen than the men, because cavemen were home chest feeding.
Very good. And, well, go woke, go broke, some books where, listen, it's all around us. That's why we're here every week. We run out of time. Sorry about that, but we'll come to see you
what about
next
the Chicago
Sunday.
Stuff, Rowan?
Well, so much more for next Sunday. We will see you next Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Thank you so much for watching Outsiders. Have a great rest of the day. We'll see you next week.